Monica, for those who don't know, has been a real mentor to me over these last many years. I think we're beginning to date ourselves. I met Monica clearly nearly 30 years ago in 1993, 94 in Belfast, Northern Ireland. So it's coming up on 28 years. And Monica has written her brilliant memoir, which she'll be discussing here this afternoon. But we thought it was really important for Monica's experience and voice to be shared with a broader audience, not just here in the United States, but those who are joining us from abroad. Whether here in the United States in particular, but around the world. We're at a moment I think a lot of people find distressing, a lot of people find hard to navigate. And there are a lot of really profound divisions that we're facing. And I'll speak here as an American, certainly in the United States, but you can look in Western Europe, you can look at certainly what's happening on a pretty acute level in Ukraine. But there are a range of challenges we're facing that really concern all of us. And I know most people who are not involved in leadership at different levels, either in activist movements or political movements. And Monica has background in both as an activist and then going into politics out of necessity and then serving in government, is to really look to those who've had real experience to sort of say, how do we navigate this time we're in? How do we navigate the uncertainty of the spaces we're in? And how do we deal with people we have profound disagreements with in our own communities and even across those community lines? And so Monica, I think, brings a lot of experience and real wisdom to this. And before we jump into introducing Monica, and hopefully soon Kevin, let me give you a brief background on Beyond Conflict for those who don't know. This year is our 30th anniversary, and as an organization, we have worked in, hard to believe, nearly 75 countries over these 30 years, with a very simple approach and a very modest approach, I like to think, of the power of shared experience. I often sort of joke, it's like a big support group on wheels. What we do is we bring people who live in countries or regions who never imagined change was possible, or they themselves could be an instrument of change, either as individuals or working with others, not just within their own communities, but across the divides. And, I often like to think that what we try to do is put oxygen into a space that didn't exist and invited other people to come in. And one of the things as an American NGO starting in the early 90s is that we had a certain privilege at that time to set a table and bring people in. But we didn't have the experience to offer that people like Monica did in Northern Ireland with people in Bosnia or the Middle East or Central America, or as Monica will talk about in the 90s, learning from people in South Africa and Central America and elsewhere who struggled with their own transitions. And so at the core of our approach was trying to set that table, convene those with lived experience to share it with those who are trying to figure out how do we make progress, whether it's trying to end a conflict, whether it's trying to reconcile in the midst of a transition, or stuck in the middle of a very dysfunctional situation and saying, where do we go from here? And that's been the core of our approach. And it was a real privilege to work in Northern Ireland with Monica and many others, really over a 10 to 15 year period. And then more recently, in the last decade, we started working with brain and behavioral scientists. And Monica's participated in some of those conversations at MIT and elsewhere. And why did we go to brain and behavioral science? Because it was an organic transition from our shared experience work to and always ask the question, what are we missing? What are we missing about the human experience that would help us navigate the world we live in and the change we seek? And one of the most important things I learned as a non-scientist was hearing scientists say, we need to focus on how we think, not just what we think, because how we think is so deeply unconscious. And that's why we started focusing a bit on brain and behavioral science. And one plug I'll give is about a year and a half ago, we released a report called America's Divided Mind, Understanding the Psychology That Divides Us. And we have a second report coming out this week that looks at social and identity status threat and how much that is driving our disunity in the United States. And it's certainly not unique to the United States, as Monica will talk about in Northern Ireland, where, at the core, the conflict was, I think, about identities and not just about religion. So with that, I'll be stepping in for Kevin Cullen, hopefully not for the full conversation, because I would love to hear from Kevin. And just a quick background on Kevin before I turn to Monica. Kevin is a columnist with the Boston Globe, but was also the London bureau chief for the Boston Globe and one of the most informed journalists writing about Northern Ireland in Europe, particularly during the process of the peace process. And let me turn now to Monica so we can maybe step into the conversation. Monica, as you may know, was an educator, professor. She was stepped into politics, what Monica will talk about in terms of women's issues, gender issues, equity issues, health issues, saw things starting to fall apart. And then out of necessity with other colleagues, founded the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, which actually stood for elections, got elected to the Good Friday peace process talks, participated in them, and then got elected to the assembly that emerged from that process. And then was the first human rights ombudsman in Northern Ireland following the Good Friday Agreement. And today not only remains active in civil society and politics, but also looking at issues of demobilization of paramilitaries on both sides. And Monica has shared a lot of her experience, not only in Northern Ireland, but around the world. So maybe, Monica, I'll turn to you first while we're waiting for Kevin, and ask you, why did you write your memoir? And what has it been to look back over 25 or longer, because you tell your full life story, and writing a book?
Well, first, Tim, thank you very much for this invitation. And maybe during this talk, I'll be able to say something about when we first met and how formative that was on my later years at the peace talks. And back then it was transitional justice and issues like that, but Beyond Conflict has had an enormous role to play and features quite a bit in the book. But why did I write it? Well, first, I want to say thank you. And in many ways, I wanted to write back in the stories that were never told. And so the United States, the importance of the role the United States played, the administration, and still does. That's one of the stories, this influence of South Africa. And when President Mandela brought us to South Africa, and how incredibly important that was. Indeed, we had a call for ceasefire and an implementation of that ceasefire a week after we returned from South Africa, and the peace talks became much more serious. But the main reason was because the women I knew who had worked at the coalface and the front lines, who were at also the peace table, had more or less been written out of history. And I guess the historians, predominantly male historians, got to write that history. And others didn't really mention us. And I thought, well, there is an onus on me, a responsibility on me, probably because I was an academic and had written numerous papers about the role of women in conflict resolution, that I felt I needed to write the book. My father was a great storyteller, but there's a difference between being an oral storyteller and writing it on paper. And I literally had to turn myself inside out, because as an academic, I'd always been telling my students, stand back, be objective, bring the analysis, look down from the balcony. Well, you do the opposite when you're writing a memoir. You put yourself into your own shoes and you start talking about your feelings. And I prayed that I would have the gift and from my father of telling those stories on paper. So there was a bunch of reasons. And then along came lockdown, where you have to be still and quiet. And I finally got the wish, came true, that I had wished that I would have time to write a book about those experiences and about the life that I had led, both experiencing the tragedies and the triumphs. And when I finally put my laptop down, I wrote it on a small laptop during that year. I must say I felt a great sense of relief.
I can imagine, because it's not just I would imagine, the act of writing, which every writer talks about how difficult that is, but it's about your own lived experience and how to be both a judge and a jury at the same time, right?
Absolutely. And if you're in politics in a conflicted society, you're going to be examined quite and scrutinized about what you write and about who you write about. So when I say there were stories in the book that were never told, I actually wrote to some of those individuals. You were there on one of those occasions when a conversation took place between a man whose son had been in the IRA and had been shot by a member of the British Army unit. And he told a very sad story. And Jeffrey Donaldson, now our the main leader of the main party, was there and asked me afterwards, could he talk to him? They had never spoken to him. In fact, his party at the peace talks said that they would never speak to anyone who was their perceived enemy. And I introduced them, and they sat all night by the fire. And so I wrote to both of them asking if I could tell that story all these years later. And they allowed me, they gave me permission. There's others I didn't ask permission of. And I, needless to say, 3 lawyers looked over the book because I didn't want to end up in court. So some people say they'd like to see what ended up in the cutting floor as much as what was in the book itself. So the feelings had to be there, Tim, and some of them were very personal. And so I started the book by talking about my value system and my parents and the influence of my brothers and sisters. And I think that was very important. I didn't know where to start, but that's very important in terms of my Catholic upbringing. Civil rights breaks out. Then I experienced a lot of tragedy during those years. And my time in America, in Detroit at the University of Michigan, all incredibly influential for a very young girl.
Finally here.
Right. Well, Monica, my whole
Monica, not the last time I'll interrupt you.
So Kevin, welcome. I'm glad you've joined us, and I'm going to transition to you. I introduced you to the audience, but I just teed you up by asking Monica why she wrote her book. And don't know if you heard it, but it's, as you can imagine, as somebody who writes every day, it's only a difficult journey to write. But it's also when you're revealing something about yourself in a conflicted society and all those conflicts you have in the process, right? And how do you navigate that? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kevin, and leave it to the great Kevin Cullen and Monica McWilliams.
Yeah, not so much a technical genius, I'll admit that. I have to say, Monica, I really enjoyed your book, and I learned more. I thought I knew a lot about you, but I learned an awful lot more. But I thought, like anyone from Northern Ireland, identity is so central to people's beings. I was wondering if you could tell everybody here, what shaped your identity, about where you grew up, how you grew up, and what kind of identity did you have when you went off to school?
Well, I grew up on a farm and in a very small village. And in the book, I talk about being very aware of the segregation in that village. Even though we had neighbors who were Protestants, to my shame, I responded to something they said. These should have been friends we played with every day, and we went to different schools, so we didn't. And they said once, Protestants are better than Catholics. And I said, no, they're not. I'll prove it to you by showing you what we've got in our house. My parents were away, their parents were away, and we literally emptied the contents of both houses out onto the street. And we won that competition because I found a box of chocolates. And we were so proud of the fact that we were able to say to them, we're as good as you. Now, why would a child of 7 do such a thing if it hadn't been in my conscience that I must have internalized what they had said and I wanted to prove them wrong? My mother was affronted and she sent me to apologize, which I did. Why was I picked out amongst my brothers and sisters to go and apologize? She probably figured I was the troublemaker who'd started it. But what worried me more was that they weren't sent to apologize to our house. So those are the kinds of stories I wanted to tell, that we lived amongst each other, but not really beside each other. We never got to know each other. There was 2 of everything. And I say it was a bit like the nursery rhyme, rub-a-dub-dub, the butcher, the maker, the candlestick maker. But in our case, there was 2 butchers. There was 2 chemists. There was 2 of everything. And there shouldn't have been, because the small town couldn't have survived. It didn't have a big enough population. But therein lay the identity issue and who you did your trade with. That's gone now. As much as due to supermarkets coming in as to do with the peace process.
Right.
But I'm very grateful for that. So we were segregated, and today that remains an issue, Kevin, of
Yeah.
how integrated we are and how we are more comfortable with our identity. And I talk about my Catholic value system. I went to all girls Catholic schools, and I valued that education. Though I also talk about some of the things that weren't right about it either. And then one of the funny stories in the book is about how I am now known as the girl on the run with the gun. When the English teacher asked us to help her with the poem, the famous war poem, The Naming of the Parts. And I had been out on the fields with my father during when the lambs were being born and the dogs were worrying the sheep. So he taught me how to put the gun together and how to dismantle it. And he said, bring that into school. He didn't worry about it. Well, you can imagine the school went into lockdown when they discovered that this young girl had brought a gun in her hockey bag, put it all together and set it on the table. So I was sent home, and that story's in the book, and how I later became known as the girl on the run with the gun. So all of those things, my education system, my parents, the going from farm to farm every summer, and early on, I tell the story about my brothers and my sisters going to pick potatoes. The school in Ireland in those days allowed you to go for a week because the farmers needed us in the fields. Well, the boys got paid twice as much as the girls, but we were picking as many potatoes as they were. And in fact, they were cheating by putting stones into their baskets until the farmer found that out. So I think I was age 10 when I asked for everyone to join me in a strike against the farmer for equal pay.
The start of many things. Hey, you know, the Catholic/nationalist civil rights movement in Northern Ireland was really modeled itself on the African American civil rights movement. And you cut your teeth really politically and socially in that civil rights movement. And you ended up going to school in Michigan and saw sort of that American. Talk a little about that, just those experiences and how that shaped you.
I remember it well, sitting in the kitchen in the farmhouse, and we had just bought a black and white television, and in came the pictures from the United States of Martin Luther King and his famous speeches, which began to really resonate with what we were going through, and the song "We Shall Overcome," which was a peaceful song, and our parish priest had invited Joan Baez to the parish hall to sing. And in that song, there are words about we will find peace one day. And I often thought, which will we find first? This kind of sense that we're going to end up in a bad setup, or if we're going to find a peaceful resolution to our civil rights here at home. And so I was very aware, Kevin, of the poverty in my own town. We had a slum called Kabul. I didn't know it was the capital of Afghanistan. I just thought that was the name of that area. But it was given that because of the housing conditions. And it was said later that the only redevelopment that ever took place in the 50s and it should have taken place at the Second World War was the Germans when they bombed our villages and the city of Belfast. It was they who demolished the old slums. So to the shame of the Unionist government, they did not invest in proper social housing. We had houses called Tin Town because they only had corrugated zinc roofs. So all of these places were well known and terrible, terrible housing conditions. Then we had the lack of fair employment. And I, to my shame, carried a placard that said, "One man, one vote," when it should have been one person, one vote. So civil rights came across the Atlantic in a great big wave and hit us. But women's rights had not come across the Atlantic at the same time. So when the civil rights marches started, I was about 15. I still have my civil rights card. And I went off to the parish hall and signed up. And those were very peaceful marches. And I tell the story in the book about how we should have known Bloody Sunday was going to happen the following week, but we didn't. When the army attacked us, and actually attack is probably the proper word, here we were peacefully protesting on a beach in McGilligan with only sand at our feet. And suddenly CS gas came in our direction and rubber bullets, and people went down all around me. And it's that famous picture of John Hume um, in a very cross mood with the commander, saying these are innocent people just marching for their rights, more or less saying, why are you using such repressive tactics? And John probably had figured out this was not going to go in a good direction. I myself thought, and here's a lesson for the States, I think, I thought, right, we will march, we will get these rights, things will, not be very pleasant for the next year. But after that, a year or two, we will settle down and have a fair democracy. Little did I think that day as I left that beach that I would be experiencing 30 years of an onslaught of horrible, terrible violence. So that was certainly a lesson, and it's probably a lesson for the United States as well.
Yeah. When that civil rights movement, not just what happened in Derry and before that, even at Burntullett Bridge, at various marches, the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland was literally beaten off the streets. And obviously it led to what we knew as the violent period and the Troubles. But obviously some people decided after the response by the British government, by the local government run by unionists, was just to beat protesters off the street rather than address those grievances. Some people decided that only violence would work, but you weren't one of those people.
I wasn't.
Why?
And I've just come from a meeting this afternoon. I'm now on the commission to disband armed groups. And you might ask, after 25 years of a peace agreement, why would you need to have a commission to do that? And so a discussion came up about why some of these were around. And this afternoon, we had the relatives of and members of prisoners who'd been in prison for many years. One said he'd been in for 16 years, who had been in the IRA. And he said that the biggest recruitment was the way that, for the IRA, was the way the British Army overreacted, and that was the biggest recruitment they ever had. So there lies a lesson, as I've seen in other conflicted societies, in Syria, for instance, where they rose up in demanding rights and fairness, and they were put down in a very inhumane and degrading way. So that's a lesson. Do not use repressive tactics when someone is demanding the same rights as exists in the rest of Britain. Can you believe it? I write in the book that all we were looking for were exactly the same rights that existed elsewhere. So if you had to turn the clock back, in the book I also say that there was a motion in the Parliament at that time for a Bill of Rights in 1966, and we still don't have it in 2022. And I drafted the advice as part of being mandated by the Good Friday Agreement when I was Chief Commissioner. I drafted that advice, and it gathers dust on Boris Johnson's desk as we speak, at the same time as we have Brexit and the same time as he's threatening to revert from the Human Rights Act. So all of those things are very worrying, and perhaps they do not genuinely understand that had we introduced those basic rights all those years ago, we would not have had the 30 years of conflict that followed.
Agreed. Everyone I've met in Northern Ireland over the years, Monica, has a story about violence and about it, and violence is such an, once it's unleashed, it's so hard to control. But like I said, there was violence that happened that led people to become violent or choose violence. But more often, violence just convinced people that this was pointless. I'm curious if there was something in your life.
Yeah.
The one event.
That. You're quite right, Kevin, and I didn't answer a comprehensive answer. Why not me? And I just could not have engaged in that level of violence. I knew what, to take a life, even if no matter how angry you are. And I guess there was a distinction between men and women, though many women did join the IRA, but I did not. And my mother was very concerned that my brothers might get caught up. In the book, I quote a poem from my very good friend Avla Kilmurray after the Shankill bomb, where I held her newborn baby. And she wrote, well, first we asked ourselves, what kind of world are we bringing him into? Because it was just bomb after bomb after bomb. But she also wrote victim or perpetrator. And it seemed that that's what, if you weren't on a perpetrator, you were going to be a victim. And so you kept your head down. And I didn't. I was kind of very outspoken about what was happening. But it was really going to the United States, going to getting that scholarship after my boyfriend was murdered in 1974. And I was given the opportunity to get a scholarship to Ann Arbor. And I was allowed by my African-American professor to join his all-Black class in Detroit. And it was the best experience of my life, because I had left a city notorious for sectarianism and was coming to a city notorious for racism. And the same question can be asked: why do some take up militant tactics to get their rights, and why do others find a more peaceful way to protest? And I did it through legislation, through policy changes, and through planning. I was an urban planner. But, you know, and I still to this day work on campaigns and joined social movements. So I was in the civil rights movement. It was an all-male movement predominantly, so I write about that. And so when the women's rights movement came along, another good reason when I started advocating against the laws, to change the laws on domestic violence and rape, which I write about in the book, and I went to those court cases and saw the injustice against women who were being abused and assaulted through perpetrators who were getting off. And again, that turned me off the notion that any violence in reaction to violence will ever bring you to a better place.
At some point, Monica, you and many other women decided that if there was going to be a settlement, that if the thing we knew as the Troubles was going to be resolved to some extent, there needed to be more women in the political process. And that was, I guess, the essence of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Tell me how that happened. How did Pearl, how did the other women that really were behind this movement, how did you put it together?
Well, here I want to speak about Beyond Conflict, Kevin, if you'll bear with me for a minute. I want to read something from my book, because there was a huge influence that Tim Phillips was involved in. And he may not know this, but I want to just read something. It was after those funerals that I've just spoken about, when we were in despair, and I was in despair. And I say the funerals took place day after day. And on one of the days, two of the corteges passed each other by accident. And one was the funeral of a victim of the bombing, IRA man. The other was one of the bombers. He was the IRA man. The victims were, you know, all in the Shankill, all Protestant. And this was really, really disastrous for anything that we could have imagined. And of course, there was retaliation the following week at Greysteel and some of the people there. And so I was standing at too many funerals at this time and in despair. When the two groups of mourners encountered each other, the anger on their faces was clear to see. For me, it was pure hatred. And I wondered how we could ever be able to come together again after such atrocities. And then I talk about when Avila gave birth to her baby in the Royal Maternity on the Falls Road 2 nights after the bomb. I ran the gauntlet of army checkpoints to find my way there. The centre of town was completely deserted. This was Belfast. People were indoors. The soldiers were the only ones on the street. And there was a curfew had fallen over the city. And as I held that baby in my arms, I despaired at the world we were bringing him into. And the following year, there was a ceasefire. And so I talk about what happens and what brings me into a completely new situation. Not long after the ceasefires, I was invited, because of my work on the ground, to an event at the Europa Hotel as part of the Justice in Times of Transition project, which was the forerunner of Beyond Conflict. The organizer, Tim Phillips, came from Boston, and he brought with him the Nobel Peace Prize winner and former president of Costa Rica, Oscar Arias, to talk about his experiences of negotiating a transition out of conflict. His words that night had a profound effect on me. He said, "You have marched, denounced, demanded, divided, slayed, bombed, and even starved yourselves to death at times. You say it's difficult to achieve peace here. Perhaps it is, but it wasn't easy in South Africa. It was not easy in El Salvador, and yet it is happening. And if it can happen there, why not here? And I go on then just to say who else was at that meeting. And there was the famous Jan Urban, who gave me an idea that night of his civic forum and his Charter 77. And his words left a mark. He said, when you spend most of your time as a victim or believing yourself to be a victim, there's no responsibility attached. And he advised us not to leave it to the establishment, but for groups from civil society to get involved. And then came Cyril Ramaphosa and Ralph Mayer from the opposite sides of the political divide in South Africa. That night, they shared how they had been transformed by coming together to draft their new South African constitution. And when Ralph was asked about leadership, as I did ask him, his answer was, do not look for a Mandela. Do what is required yourself. I went home that night wondering how, as someone already active on the ground in civil society, I could perhaps become more active in the fledgling peace process. And then President Clinton and Hillary Clinton as First Lady come to town. And that night I walked into the city centre with my sons to watch Bill and Hillary switch on the Christmas tree lights. For 8-year-old Gavin and 6-year-old Rowan, it was one of the most magical nights ever, sitting on security barriers and standing at the lights and looking up at the lights reflecting on the podium's bulletproof glass. The Irish News described it as the Belfast's biggest ever street party, with 100,000 people from all parts of the city, north, south, east, west, coming together. It was a sight to behold. Van Morrison was singing Days Like This, and Gavin, Rowan and I hummed the tune all the way home. I hoped that night that the political parties would use the momentum that was building to make a real breakthrough. And so the next chapter is about how we as the Women's Coalition made that breakthrough. There was peace talks declared. We were not on the list of the parties because there was no existing party. We wrote to all the parties and asked would they put some women delegates at the table. None of them wrote back except for very small groups. And we said perhaps we should scare the life out of them and say we're going to form a party ourselves from both sides, a vanguard kind of action. Little did we think, Kevin, with no money, no offices, no mobile phones, which had just been invented, that 6 weeks later we would get elected. And our slogan was, wave goodbye to dinosaurs.
Right.
So that's the story of how we came together. And we weren't welcomed, as you can imagine. We were outsiders who had become.
The other thing about the peace process is that, you know, in Northern Ireland, the political culture was that some politicians made a career out of saying no. Compromise, even talking to the other side, was somehow considered treachery. How did the peace process, and very specifically your role in it, when you were in those talks, how do you chip away at that? How do you change a political culture where politicians are not only punished but are actually rewarded for not talking to the other side?
Well, they obviously hadn't heard what Ralph Mayer and Cyril Ramaphosa said in Belfast. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget what they said. They said, when you're in a crisis, pick up the phone and speak to the person on the other side. Right. Not when there's a triumph or a success, but when you're in trouble. Mm-hmm. Now, the parties at our table took some pride in never speaking to their opponents. Ulster Unionists said that they would never speak to anybody affiliated to the IRA until every gun was decommissioned. The IRA folks and those affiliated to them said, that sounds like you want us to surrender before you're going to say good morning. Now, the difference with the Women's Coalition was that we said we would speak to every party, right, including those that in the first year, Sinn Féin were not at the table. So we opened up back channels to them. And in the book, I talk about how hard, Kevin, that was for the women from the unionist tradition in our party, because their members of their family had been police officers or British soldiers had been murdered. And Pearl in particular talks about not even hearing her heartbeat. Her heartbeat was so strong, that's what she said,
Mm.
that she couldn't hear the words they were saying in some of those meetings
Oh.
because she was so anxious about, one, people finding out who she was talking to, but also the notion that these were like enemies that shouldn't be spoken to, terrorists as they were known. And that had a profound effect on me also. My brain kicked in and said, wow, people are actually so concerned, so fearful, that they might even change their views about some of these individuals if they meet them face to face. So it wasn't surprising to me on Good Friday when we finally signed off on the agreement that we were going to have trouble implementing it, when there had been no human relationships built around that table.
Right.
Most of the discussions were through Senator Mitchell as chairperson, and the two governments. But we, the Women's Coalition, had written down every single thing during those 2 years that the parties were telling us. And in turn, we made responses to what they were saying. And we submitted that to the chairperson. And he commended us in his book afterwards, saying that the coalition played an enormous role, facilitating, mediating, but also, Kevin, as negotiators, we had our own agenda. Right. And we never forgot that. And we were very proud on Good Friday that we had managed to get our issues into the agreement. The issues around victims, the chapter on reconciliation, integrated education, the civic forum, today known as the Citizens' Assembly, resources for young people, and the list goes on. But had we not been at the table, there would not have been a single line in that agreement on those issues.
Yeah, it's interesting that, again, the woman or women role here was, it's almost as if you folks weren't bound by all the years that built up a political culture in which you were supposed to ignore the other side, or at least insult them. And it seemed like, but that it had a rubbing off effect, that people did talk to each other inside. And obviously there was what was going on, there was a slightly theater that when people would come out at the end of the day of negotiations, they would preach to the choir, talk to their base, but it was very different inside, I assume.
Yeah, and in the United States at the minute, the question I would ask is, who's talking to who?
Correct.
Are you crossing the aisles?
Right.
Are you finding out what is really, it's easy to hurt the other side. It's easy to say hurtful things. Right. Often, that's not a good tactic, because all you're doing is putting the goalposts up higher for the other side. And they sure as hell will come back and say something hurtful to you. So for 2 years at that table, that's all I heard. And perhaps you need a bit of venting when people have been in a long conflict. But there's a stage at which you need to get down to business. Right. Otherwise, we're just going, it's a conversation of the deaf. I talk about a forum that was established called the Forum for Dialogue and Understanding. And we women stood up and renamed it as the Forum for Monologue and Misunderstanding, because all they were doing was talking to their own side. That's the first thing. Talk to the other side, find out what their interests are, see if you can reach some consensus between what you need and what they need. I say all that in the book. But, human relationships are everything. Hence, what Beyond Conflict, the work they're doing now in trying to understand the psychology of violence. And I said at the table, I confronted Ian Paisley and said, the violence of your tongue may have led to the violence of the gun. And that was not an easy conversation. But I wanted to put on the table, as long as these men kept talking about guns and weapons, we were not going to get behind the mindset that led to the use of those guns. And you have that conversation in the United States as well.
Right.
The attitudes, the terrible attitudes of hatred that leaves somebody to pick up a gun, as what happened in Buffalo, to take out life. Where has those attitudes come from? And what do we need to put a system in place at a very, very early age that confronts that kind of thinking?
Yeah. You've watched, like everyone else, the sort of political polarization in this country increase. And I guess it would be no surprise to you that has coincided with a lack of communication, that politicians in this country don't talk to each other as much as they do the cameras.
And that's a disaster,
Yeah.
by using your cameras as proxy. I mean,
Right.
we have some of that here. It's come across the Atlantic
Sure.
to here. We have a show, and it is a show. I would prefer if it was called a program every morning on the radio, and he's also on TV. And he says a thing like, make the news, get the news. Great. I want to get the news. The next two lines are, be the news, make the news. In other words, anybody can make it up. You can be the news. Who are you to be the news? You have to have a serious analysis in order to be the news. So you get all these people like you do in the States suddenly becoming experts on what's needed. And it often is speaking out of a very righteous type of voice, that righteousness is only on their side.
Right.
And that's not a good politics. And I have to say, my son lives in Chicago and has made his home there, that I hope for his sake that toxicity can be taken out of politics. It is the road to nowhere. And I despair actually in what I'm seeing in the United States, because as you can imagine, we follow the United States very closely here. And I have to say, they were a champion of our peace process. I want the United States to get back to that day.
Isn't that the great irony that the American influence in Northern Ireland was basically, you guys need to talk to each other. You need to put all that terrible history behind. And instead of talking about the past, let's talk about the future. That was sort of the American influence, if you sum it up. And yet look at where our politics has arrived now. The other great irony here is that one of the very few matters of policy that Democrats and Republicans agree on is support for the Northern Ireland peace process. It remains to this day, because it was something that was successively promoted by both Democratic and Republican administrations. They had a shared interest and they had a shared sense of accomplishment. And yet we look elsewhere and that those things do not exist.
Yeah, and I write about that in the book, Kevin. But equally, I also write about my encounters with George Bush in the book, and what led to that war in Iraq. And I said to him, it's easy to put boots on the ground. It's hard to get those boots out. And that was our experience. But I also put down some of the principles about, why you would go to war. Because ethically, you need to have good reasons. And that's when I think foreign policy changed. He said to me, and I wasn't sure whether I should put this in the book, a couple of things. We'd first met in the White House just after 9/11, and it was a huge tragedy. And he said, I never forgive those people in Afghanistan. And I said, look, Jerry Adams is standing here in front of me from the Republican side of the House. And we have David Irvine, leader of the Loyalists, both affiliated and negotiating on behalf of armed groups in different times. I said, if they would not be standing here in front of you, Mr. President, today, if that was the case. I said, we won't forget, and perhaps we won't forgive, but we do have to negotiate our way out of this. And that's what we did. So the next time I met him, it was about Saddam Hussein. And I said, look, it would be good for you to follow the United Nations and what is being discussed about whether or not they had nuclear weapons. And I wrote out in a letter those things that I've put in the book. And he said, hit me with it. You again, he said. And then he said, hit me with it. And I said, no, I just want you to read it. And he said, don't you know Saddam Hussein is a gangster, a rapist, and a criminal? And the whole room went quiet at the sound of someone saying rapist, as a room does. And I got very embarrassed and thinking the President of the United States is talking to me when he actually should be moving on to talk to more important people. And I said back to him, Mr. President, I am representative elected for South Belfast, and I deal with rapists, gangsters, and criminals every day in my constituency. But I'm not going to bomb them from the air. I'm going to follow due process. I do believe you should go to the United Nations. Eventually, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, said to him, come on, we have to go to lunch. He said, I have to have the last word with this woman. And I said, no, Mr. President, you don't go on to lunch. So those are the
Okay,
kinds
well,
of conversations, Kevin. What I'm really
right.
saying is those are, it's good to engage. And I don't know if President Bush gained anything from his experience in Northern Ireland. In
Mm,
fact, I'm disappointed that Tony Blair didn't.
right.
The Prime Minister then formed that coalition and went into Iraq when he should have known what and learned and did indeed from our own experience here in Northern Ireland.
Right. I just want to interject here for the audience. We could accept some questions from Monica if you had anything in particular. So if you'd like to send a question, please just hit the chat button on your screen and send those questions in, and we'll get them to Monica before we wrap up. Monica, I want to say, 24 years on, the Good Friday Agreement remains sort of a blueprint for other societies to get beyond conflict. And yet, here we are, and there's still, you have local government, the power sharing government is out as much as it's in. People still have trouble talking to each other directly about shared interest. And then there's obviously there is reconciliation is proving harder than the just stopping violence, that in that vacuum, you have to fill it in with reconciliation. There's still a lot of segregation, whether it's housing, whether it's education. How do you, 24 years on, how do you see where the Good Friday Agreement succeeded and where it needs to be more implemented in a realistic way?
Well, Kevin, I say these days over the issue of Brexit, 25 years ago, when I got up from that table, I said it was hard to make it. So make sure you don't break it.
Right.
And that's probably why Richie Neal and 12 members of Congress are in Belfast today.
Right.
It's an international treaty. And he quite rightly said, I don't interfere in domestic politics, because he's got pushback from unionists here saying, what are you doing messing in our process? And he said, I'm not engaged in domestic politics. I'm engaged in the international treaty, making sure it's implemented. So my first message is in the final chapter, implement what you promise.
Mhm.
If it's only a piece of paper at the end of the day, that Good Friday Agreement, but it's a beautiful agreement. It's comprehensive. It was an inclusive process, but did we deliver? We delivered, and here is the important point, Kevin. We delivered a lot. I live in a very peaceful country now compared to when I was growing up. My children are able to aspire to things that I couldn't have dreamed of, and people wrote me those letters. So I end the book on that note, saying, let's never forget. And we've tasted the prize of peace, and we won't be going back. And that's my job these days, is to make sure that the paramilitaries don't go back. But there is a nervousness. So how do we get beyond that? And that's where the governments come in. But I am optimistic that we will get through this. Yes, it's been like a roller coaster, and I've been on that roller coaster. But I guess also my message is about relationships. Keep building them. And I say I'm a long flight bird in this process. And I'll keep on fighting for those issues.
Right. Monica, do you take heart from the most recent assembly elections? The number of women elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly is one of the highest, if not the highest figure of any legislative body in Europe. Higher than the Republic of Ireland, higher than the UK. Why do you think that's happened?
Well, Kevin, that's great that that's happened. And I brought them all together last week. And they're all young as well. The oldest on that panel last week was 42. The youngest was 26. Wow. So it's not just that it's all women. They're young women. And one of them just gave birth yesterday and brought new life into this world, and will bring new life into the assembly. So I'm delighted to see it, because the reason why we proposed a civic forum in the agreement was we thought that would take a long time to bring new blood and new politics and new spirit into the old status quo. And that has happened. And it's wonderful to see that new voice for new times. And it gives me a lot of optimism for the future. I'd like to think it was that we built some of those foundations through the Women's Coalition, that we were subjected to a lot of misogyny, a lot of insults, and we suffered a bit of harm. But we laid the foundations, and some call it the contagion effect, that what happened was other parties could see the opportunities of putting forward more women, and it became contagious. And so all the parties now see the need to have women. That's a democracy after all.
Right. But
And it's great to see.
one of the questions I just heard is both, I guess, in politics and in conflict resolution, how can men be allies to women?
Well, there are gender champions. I mean, I write in the book about how David Irvine, the working class loyalist, spoke up for me. He wasn't seen as the gentleman.
Yes.
And yet he had this incredibly strong voice for inclusion, and particularly the inclusion of women. So that's one example, through their leadership, through when I was getting a lot of insults thrown at me. He was the one who challenged those individuals. I didn't have to do it. He took the load off my shoulder.
David was a great loss, actually, at his age. Ted Kennedy told, when David died, Ted Kennedy told me he thought he had more potential than any politician he met to unite disparate forces. Well,
Senator Kennedy was right. And that's why, as a Catholic woman, in the book, I write about this Protestant leader. And we became brother and sister, like a brother and sister. That's our friendship grew so strongly. And Tim came all the way from Boston for his funeral. And I stood up at his funeral. I was asked to speak and give the eulogy at his funeral by his wife. And it was one of those symbolic moments, Kevin, when the Republicans were also in that room and the church. The leader of the Irish Republic had come, the former Taoiseach, Albert Reynolds, the head of the police. Who else could have brought such a group except for a wonderful man who'd spent time in prison as a loyalist, but then came out a changed person and spoke from the heart and the head about what reconciliation means. So there are plenty of men like that, as there are plenty of women. And so that's my hope for the future, to grow, as Rolf Mayer said, don't look for a Mandela. You will find them and grow them. And that's where I'm putting all my effort these days in a project called Politics in Action in Schools, because we still don't teach the politics in schools in case it's too contentious. And so we're bringing all these schools together now, and it's growing like a snowball gathering, and the kids love it, and it's their only opportunity to mix. And so those are all examples of what we need to do. And today at my meeting, we were talking about how we might have a hot summer, not hot, I wish, in terms of the sun shining, but hot on the streets, and how we need to calm things down and wind down the rhetoric. And I took great heart from these youth workers who are out on the streets at night, working with those young people who are a little lost at the minute, and are, paramilitaries have some coercive control over them and they're traumatized. We have a traumatized generation, and we're still dealing with it. But I have to say, I'm very heartened by the good work that I see on the ground.
That's encouraging. Last question from an audience member, and I guess it kind of full circle for what was learned in Northern Ireland and what we're going through in this country right now. What do you want to say to Americans who don't want to engage with Trump supporters?
Well, it's not a choice. They need it. I mean, I saw that in Colombia, just before the peace agreement was being signed in Colombia. I went there and they had this wonderful group of women who called themselves 1 Million Women for Peace, for Yes. You know what they did? They invited their neighbors who were against the agreement to their house for dinner. And I thought, gee, we couldn't even do that here. They called it dining for peace instead of dying for peace. But they also just, sheer hard work in reaching out to people who fundamentally disagree with you. I became a wiser person, Kevin, because of the Women's Coalition, because there were women in that coalition who ideologically thought different about their future than I did. And they explained to me why. Now, is Trump supporter a legitimate person to speak to? Probably. By finding some kind of humanity in that person. How did they come to have these attitudes that they have? And do you actually think that you're going to be able to make some changes? Because instead of going in an adversarial way or an accusatory way, you'll not change people that way. But sometimes you just change by sharing your own life story and how they can impact on your future by the things that they're saying about you at the minute. And I also don't like that they think that the morality is all on their side, as if I was an immoral person, or that righteousness is all on their side. Well, what kind of person does that make me? That's the kind of conversations I would love to have.
Terrific. Well, Monica, we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank you and thank Tim Phillips and Beyond Conflict, and also just thank you for standing up and speaking out.
Thank you. And that's the title of the book. So if
Oh,
anybody
yeah.
wants to get it, that it's in the States now and it's on Amazon and Casamet. I've been, by the way, Kevin, it was Americans taught me to do that. My mother always used to say, don't be promoting yourself. Self-praise is no praise. That's such an Irish thing. So one of the things I'll finish with is that I'm very grateful to all of you in the United States who helped me on my journey and helped me to believe in myself. And I say that in the book.
Well, we'll promote for you, Monica, because if there's a link that's up on the Beyond Conflict website, and people will be able to find. But I would really encourage people to read this book, because it's one woman's story, but it really tells what happened in the north of Ireland. And it was great to see you again.
Thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks to all in Beyond Conflict, and to everyone who took the time out today to listen to this woman from Belfast. Thanks a million.
Cheers.